some way of knowing about an unknown motive? I mean, like,
yeah,
in order to
yeah,
sense the wonder.
yeah. It's not a good analogy. It's Kale, isn't it? Yeah, it's not a perfect analogy. The analogy of bulbs. The point of the analogy, as I used it, was to say that bulbs are unconscious, yet somehow or other they respond.
That's my question. What would Aristotle say that, I mean, if the soul of an inert object, like a bulb or a star, is not conscious, and by what virtue does it wonder?
Yeah, well, does he mean conscious wonder? You see? Does he mean conscious love, conscious wanting, desiring? Or does he simply mean there is a natural tendency, you see? A natural tendency towards some kind of activity that is native to those things? He's very explicit that you don't have to ascribe consciousness to all teleological processes. Teleological is oriented towards final causes. No. He's equally insistent, and that in the section on nature from the physics that you've been reading. He's equally insistent that final causes operate in every natural process. Some conscious in humans, and to some extent in animals, but otherwise unconscious. But there are still final causes. Why? Well, the final cause is intrinsic to the thing, because its nature, its form, you see, comes loaded with that potential, with that tendency, that drive. You remember the picture in the Timaeus that Plato gives you of God winding the universe up, letting it go and it sort of runs down? Well, it's as if Aristotle is saying it never needed winding up in the first place, but it never runs down because God continues to exert some sort of magnetic attraction. Yeah.
In order to maintain it, don't you have to use force?
No, not if the natural process has sufficient force within itself, which properly actualized and directed produces the goods. All you have to do is to free that up.
Is Aristotle's God a good God in the sense that we use the word as adjective, or is it a good as a capital G?
Yeah, he's using it as an adjective, as Plato did, as well as a noun. Perhaps your question is whether it means some sort of metaphysical perfection, or whether it means moral perfection. Get the distinction? Metaphysical perfection, the most perfect kind of being that could be. You see. Well, certainly he means the first, the metaphysical. And the way he talks in chapter 10 and one or two other places in his writings, I think he means the second, moral. I think he means the second. I used to criticize Aristotle's view of God by saying that the God concept has various functions. It has a metaphysical function in grounding or completing a metaphysical scheme. And Aristotle's God certainly does that. Okay. God concept also has a moral function, as embodying the ideal of what it is to be morally good, good in nature, in character, in action. And Aristotle says enough that I think he implies that. In fact, all of the Greeks seem to think that that which is metaphysically good is by definition morally good if the moral value is grounded in the metaphysical. Now, the other function that a God concept has, of course, is as an object of religious adoration, an object of religious devotion. And I used to criticize Aristotle by saying that his God is no object of religious devotion. But over the last 2 or 3 years, as I've been rereading Aristotle, I don't think that's right. Take this term wonder, love, wanting to be like, and the concept of the imitation of God is there. You see, to say the contemplation of God is our highest activity sounds awfully like religious language. You see? And in one place in his politics, he says the government should support religious temples. Yeah, fund them. As if religion, which is supportive of the moral good, is in the interest of the state, whose function is to achieve a good life, which is morally good, and religion, Aristotle sees, is supportive of that. So, yeah, I think that Aristotle's God, while as presented in the metaphysics, of course, is going to be performing primarily metaphysical function, still has in his thinking moral and religious function as well. Yeah. So I had to change my mind on that.
One thing that bothers me about this unmoved mover as God, he seems almost kind of pointless and silly. In the fact that he just sits around and thinks about his thinking, and it seems like perhaps he, and maybe this is because I've been brought up in a different era, that he doesn't have any basis or reason for like romantic virtues, passion and love. And that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure the word silly is the right word. Remote, detached, unconcerned. You know, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. No, there's no four spiritual laws in Aristotle. No, nothing of that. I suppose you might want to say impersonal, in the sense of not being personally concerned. Though if conscious thought and moral character are essentials in defining personhood, then it does sound as if Aristotle's God might, the way he talks, be personal in that sense. But he's a long way short of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Further short of the God incarnate in Jesus Christ. You see, loving and giving himself. Oh yeah, far, far short of that, indeed. As is usually true of the God of natural theology. After all, if you're trying to derive some sort of an understanding of God from what you know of the natural order, you see, what is it Romans 1 tells us we can know? His eternal power and Godhead. You see, there are limits to this, certainly. And most people who try to do natural theology say there's a lot more about God that has to come from revealed religion. And the thing is, Aristotle wasn't satisfied with the religions of their day. Yeah.
When you talk about
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, you're right on. You see, what happens in the developing thought of the, next thousand years? Well, the next 2 or 3, 500 years, within 500 years of Aristotle, is that this business of how to relate the world of eternal ideals, whether Plato's forms or Aristotle's God, to the natural world, to what we are and what we do, that issue becomes crucial. You see. It's one thing to say there are eternal patterns to imitate, even a God to imitate. But where's the exertion of power in the natural world or in the human world, in history, in human life? Well, the thing that cracked that possibility wide open was the coming into Greek thought of the Judeo-Christian conception of God as Almighty Creator. Now, the Apostles' Creed is one of the earliest Christian confessions. I believe in God the Father, Almighty Maker. Now, no Greek could say that. Plato couldn't. Almighty? Maker? Yeah, demiurge. But Almighty? You see? No, right away, the very first line of the Apostles' Creed is asserting that God is the efficient cause of creation. Wow, that was revolutionary. Well, we'll have to talk about that as we get to it. It's going to have far-reaching implications for every other time. Yeah, it generates a conflict of worldviews in patristic times. Naturalism, dualism, pantheism, Judeo-Christian theism. Yeah. Okay, one person who is very much an Aristotelian today and has written quite a bit on Aristotle, a man by the name of Henry Veach, who taught for many years at Indiana University, then at Georgetown, now retired. Delightful person. He's a Christian, very warm-hearted individual. But he makes the point in talking about Aristotle's God that Aristotle is telling us that man is not the measure of all things. God is. And I guess it takes somebody like a Christian to see that and say it so bluntly. Yeah, if you remember the sophist who said man is the measure of all things. No, Aristotle is plainly saying he's not. God is. And he's saying that the most important end for which we do things is not ourselves, because we're not the most important things in the universe. You see? So this is getting to the ethical implications, but the highest end of man is not the actualization of man. Though in relationship to God, then it may be actualization. But God is our highest end. Yeah, well, Aristotle sees that sort of direction. Okay? Well, let's see. I want now to move from Aristotle's metaphysics, including his natural theology, to look at his logic and epistemology. And this is going to be relatively brief, but I think it's very, very important. By way of preamble, let me point this out, that Aristotle's writings on logic and epistemology were brought together by his commentators and students after his death under the general rubric, the organon, which means simply method. Okay? And within the organon, you find a whole variety of works, one called the Categories, another on interpretation, another the prior analytics, another the posterior analytics, yet another the topics, and finally sophistical refutations. Now, we have in our anthology just a little bit from the Categories and a little bit from the posterior analytics. But let me just indicate the general subject matter of each, so that you can see the range of what he was up to. The Categories is dealing with the way in which terms, terms, function in our thinking. Okay? I'll come back to that in just a little while. On interpretation is dealing with the logic of propositions, not terms, but propositions. And as by now you're well aware, a proposition is something which asserts or denies something. A proposition has the form S is P, or is not P, subject, predicate, joined by a copula, predicating something of a subject. So he's talking about the logic of propositions in interpretation. The prior analytics goes one step further and talks of the logic of syllogisms. A syllogism is composed, of course, of propositions, as propositions are composed of terms. Typically, a syllogism has a major premise, proposition, a minor premise, proposition, from the logical relationship of which you deduce the conclusion, proposition. So he's developing his logical scheme, his logical system, which is endured from that day until this. Aristotelian logic is still basic logic that is still taught in logic courses and underlies much of later logical developments. In the posterior analytics, he's talking about what he calls scientific reasoning, which is how we get to our first premises, how we can know first premises, basic premises are true. Okay, that's very, very important. In the topics, he's talking about dialectic. That was an earlier work written before he discovered the syllogism. But it's about dialectical kinds of arguments valuable for debate, so forth, used in rhetoric. And the sophistical refutations is about logical fallacies that the sophists, he thinks, wantonly commit in what they're doing. So you have really, in the organon, you have an entire logic textbook, you see? And if it were not so tediously written, well, tediously read at least, it would probably make a pretty good logic textbook. And many intro to logic textbooks have precisely that kind of chapter outline, or something very much like it. Now, I want to say a few words, however, about the categories, because we've referred to that before, and you have a selection from the categories on page 282 for 5 pages or so. And a selection I want you to read with care. Actually, it's the opening section, selection, in the Aristotle materials. And you should thank me for not opening our discussion of Aristotle with it. I suspect you would have been frustrated, wondering why on earth this was important, perhaps bored, and so forth. The metaphysics is much more gripping. But in the categories, there are several things I want you to notice. One of them is the way in which he uses terms like species, genera, and differentia. Now, they're standard terms nowadays. But it's Aristotle who introduced that kind of classification of things into species. Classification of species into larger genera, singular genus, and larger families and groups and so forth. So this is simply his means of classification. Differentia refer to the essential properties which differentiate one species from another, which differentiate one genus from another. So when Aristotle speaks of humans as being rational animals or social animals, he does both. Within the genus of animals, what differentiates the human species is rationality and sociality. Those are the differentia that differentiate the human species from other animal species. So that's his terminology. And you'll find that terminology is important when he gets to asking how we know the true first premises. Because unless you know the truth about some genus or species, you can infer nothing whatsoever about anything else in that genus or species. You see? How can you argue about being unless you know something about the nature of being? How can you argue about human beings and what is good for them, morally, unless you know something about the differentia of human beings, what makes them human? You see? So in order to get the premises that he needs, he has to get at the essence, the nature of the kinds of things he's going to be discussing. That's the first thing. Secondly, in chapter 4, there on 283, he comes back to the various categories which we initially met in metaphysics as categories of being. Only here they're introduced as categories of thought. And he gives very clearly the list that he wants on 283, chapter 4, of things said without combination, just by themselves as terms. Each signifies either, any word is going to signify one of these, either substance, or quality, or some qualification, or relationship, relative, or where, or when, or being in a position, or having, or doing, or being affected. Aristotle's categories. And his point is going to be, in logical reasoning, you don't switch in the middle of a discussion from one category to another. You see. In the 20th century, some British philosophers, 1950s, started accusing people of making category mistakes. A category mistake is where in the middle of a discussion you switch categories. The classic example was when Gilbert Ryle called Descartes' mind-body dualism, two entities, mind and body, a category mistake. Body, of course, is a substance. That's the right category there. But speaking of mind as a substance, a thing, rather than simply a quality or a function, is a category mistake. And so the whole mind-body problem arises from a category mistake, according to Gilbert Ryle. Aristotle is concerned that in a chain of argument, you keep your terms meaning the same, rather than switching them and equivocating. Now, some of you have heard my favorite example of that before. Goes like this: I love you, therefore I'm a lover. All the world loves a lover. You are all the world to me, therefore you love me. Now, guys, it doesn't work logically or any other way. But notice the fallacy of equivocation, using one word in two different senses, is involved in the term, and it functions as one term, all the world. You see? All the world loves a lover, empirical generalization. You are all the world to me, value judgment. Okay? The second is a value term. The first is a substance term. Category mistake. Okay? Confusing categories. Now that's the kind of mistake that he wants to avoid by pointing out. If you want the middle term in a syllogism, the link between the propositions, to stand firm, it's going to mean the same.